The gavel came down at 9:14 on a Thursday morning, and the woman holding it was already laughing. Her name was Claudia Vance. She stood behind a mahogany podium inside Ashford Hall, the kind of auction house where the chandeliers cost more than most people's cars, and the guest list was curated the same way the pieces were, by appointment only. The bidding floor smelled like old money and fresh lilies. Every chair was filled with wealth. He walked in at 9:09. His name was Marcus Webb. He wore a gray work jacket, the kind with a frayed collar and a small paint stripe near the left cuff. His boots were steel-toed and scuffed, the leather worn smooth at the toe. He carried no catalog. He had not pre-registered. The man at the door asked him twice if he was in the right place. He said he was. The room noticed him the moment he stepped inside. Not loudly, the way a room notices something that doesn't belong. He stood near the back. Quiet. Well. He watched the opening lots move through without bidding. Claudia Vance noticed him at 9:12. She let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone near her to look up. "Sir," she said, and the single word landed across the floor like a stone dropped in still water. Her voice carried the casual, polished contempt of someone who had never once been told no. "I'm not sure who let you in through the service entrance, but the property management contractors aren't needed until Thursday afternoon." Laughter. Scattered at first, then spreading. Marcus looked at her. He did not move. He did not flush. "I have a paddle," he said. She smiled at that, a wide, slow smile that she shared with the front row. She gestured toward his jacket. "Darling, the minimum opening bid on Ashford's featured lot today is $4.2 million. I do hope you haven't confused us with a foreclosure clearance." More laughter. Louder now. He stood very still. His hands were at his sides. "I know what the lot is," he said. She picked up her gavel, dismissed him with a tilt of her head, and returned to the podium. She did not know his name. That was the first thing. If Claudia Vance had simply typed the name on his paddle registration, Webb Capital Holdings LLC, into any property database in the state, she would have found 47 commercial properties. She would have found 3 completed real estate developments, 2 of which she had competed to acquire herself, 2 years earlier, and lost. She would have found a man who had arrived that morning not as a spectator, not as a contractor, but as the single largest undisclosed interested party in the featured lot. She had laughed at the wrong man. Don't look away from this. What happened in the next 48 hours did not come from luck. It did not come from a plan that began that morning. It came from 5 years of silence, of a man who had every reason to announce himself, and chose every single time not to. What Claudia Vance did in front of that room was not just rude. It was the last mistake she would make in that building. Stay with this. Marcus Webb had been waking up at 5:15 every morning for 4 years. Not because he set an alarm. Because his daughter, Nadia, woke at 5:20, and he needed 5 minutes to start the coffee and pull her school clothes from the dryer before she came down the hallway in her socks, still half asleep, listing slightly toward the wall. That was their morning. 5 quiet minutes, and then the sound of small feet on old floorboards. The apartment they lived in sat on the 3rd floor of a building on Meridian Street, a building Marcus owned, though he had never told the neighbors that. He paid himself the same below-market rent he charged everyone else and deposited the difference into a trust account he would not touch until Nadia turned 18. He had been doing that for 3 years. The account held $214,000. His company, Webb Capital Holdings, had been built entirely in silence. That was the only way he had known how to do it. He had started with $11,000 after Nadia's mother left. He had been 29. He had a daughter who was 4 months old, a lease that expired in 6 weeks, and a general contractor's license he had been carrying in his wallet since he was 24. He drove a truck. He took every job. He did not spend money on things that didn't compound. He read property listings the way other men read sports scores. The first building he bought was a derelict 6-unit on Calvert Street that no one else wanted. He paid $87,000 for it, did the rehabilitation himself over 11 months, and refinanced it for $310,000. He used that capital to buy 2 more, then 4. He never borrowed against appreciation. He never leveraged what he hadn't earned. He built slowly, deliberately, the way a man builds things when there is a child watching. People who knew him from the job sites knew him as a contractor who owned a few rentals. People who knew him from the school pickup line knew him as Nadia's dad, the one who always arrived exactly on time, who remembered every teacher's name, who once quietly paid for 3 other families' school trip fees when the teacher mentioned, offhand, that the field trip was undersubscribed. He had not left his name. He never did. The featured lot at Ashford Hall, a mixed-use commercial property at 14 Pemberton Square, had been on Marcus's watch list for 22 months. That morning at 5:20, Nadia had come down the hallway and stood in the kitchen doorway in her socks, watching him button his gray work jacket. "You look fancy," she said. He looked down at the jacket. The frayed collar. Paint stripe. "I know," he said. She tilted her head. She was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stillness, that particular quality of watching the world very carefully before deciding what to say about it. "Where are you going?" "An auction." "For what?" "A building." She considered this. "Are you going to buy it?" He poured her orange juice. He set it on the counter. "Probably," he said. She sat down at the table, opened her backpack, and started on her homework without another word. That was the whole conversation. He walked out at 5:47. He took the bus. The featured lot was scheduled for 10:30. Marcus sat in the back row for the first 90 minutes and watched 3 smaller lots move through the floor. He knew the buyers for 2 of them. One was a development group he had competed against twice before. The other was a pension fund that had been overextending into commercial real estate for the last 18 months and would, in Marcus's estimation, regret it before year's end. He watched without comment. He did not take notes. He had already done all his notes. Claudia Vance ran the floor the way a hostess runs a party she has organized specifically for her own pleasure. She knew which buyers to warm up with eye contact and which to cool with a slight pause before acknowledging their bids. She was good at her work. She was also the kind of good that had curdled, over time, into a performance of goodness, the kind that required an audience to function. She had not looked at Marcus again after his registration moment. She had filed him somewhere in the back of her mind, the way a person files an unpleasant interruption, as a thing that happened that does not need to happen again. At 9:48, a man named Gregory Chen, one of the Ashford senior staff, approached Marcus's row. He wore a blue blazer and the careful expression of someone delivering an institutional message. "Mr. Webb," he said, keeping his voice low, "I've been asked to let you know that the featured lot carries a pre-qualification requirement. Proof of funds or an active lending commitment must be verified before participation." Marcus turned to look at him. "It wasn't in the catalog," Marcus said. Chen adjusted his tie. "It's a standard floor day requirement for lots above 4 million. It wasn't in the digital edition. I apologize for the confusion. But I've been asked to escort you to the verification desk before you can bid." Marcus looked at him for a long moment. "By who?" Chen's jaw moved slightly. "By Ms. Vance. She wants to make sure the floor runs smoothly for all registered participants." Around them, 2 bidders in the adjacent rows had turned slightly in their seats. Not fully, but enough. Marcus stood up. He followed Chen to the verification desk near the far wall, in full view of the room. At the desk, a young woman asked him for his proof of funds documentation. He handed her a single sealed envelope. She opened it. She read. She went very still. She looked at the number at the top of the letter from First National Trust, and then at Marcus, and then back at the number. The letter confirmed a verified liquid position of $11.4 million. "I'll need a moment," she said. "Take your time," he said. He stood at the desk for 6 minutes while she made 2 phone calls. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, quiet, watching the room. When he returned to his seat, the 2 bidders in the adjacent rows said nothing. But they moved their chairs slightly to give him more room. Claudia Vance had watched the entire desk exchange from the podium. When he sat back down, she picked up her gavel and smiled at the room, a practiced, unrattled smile. "All right," she said. Shall we keep the morning moving? Polite laughter. Things proceeded. He called Nadia at 10:15 during the 15-minute recess. She answered on the second ring. How's school? He asked. Math was easy. Science was long. Did you eat lunch? I ate everything. Good. Did you buy the building? Not yet. Okay, she said. Call me after. He hung up. He put the phone in his pocket. He walked back into the room. The third blow came after the featured lot opened. Marcus's paddle had been placed at the far edge of the registered section, a technical seating decision that meant his bids, when raised, would be at the periphery of Claudia Vance's natural line of sight. In live auctions, position matters. Auctioneers build rhythm from the center out. Bids from the edges are slower to be recognized, easier to lose in the flow. It was not an accident. The opening bid came in at $4.2 million from a group near the front. Meridian Capital, a development consortium Marcus recognized. He knew their ceiling. He had studied their last 3 acquisition filings. They would not go past 5.8. He raised his paddle at 4.4. Vance looked left. Acknowledged a counter from Meridian. Did not look at Marcus. He raised again at 4.7. She looked right. Acknowledged. Turned back to center. A man 2 rows ahead of Marcus, a silver-haired buyer named Douglas Hart, who had been attending Ashford auctions for 30 years, turned in his seat and looked directly at Vance. You have a bid at 4.7, he said. Not loudly, clearly. Vance's smile did not waver. Thank you, Mr. Hart. She acknowledged the bid. The room felt the correction. She had made it twice now. The same man. The same peripheral dismissal. It was the kind of thing that, once noticed, could not be unnoticed. Marcus bid without expression. He raised when he needed to raise. He let the room move at its own pace. His jaw was set. His hands were steady. When Meridian Capital dropped out at 5.6, he did not react. He waited for the next counter. There wasn't one. 5.6 million, Vance said, and the room went quiet. She looked around the floor, drawing the pause out. 5.6. Do I have? 5.8, said a voice from the left side. A late entrant. A buyer who had not been in the catalog. The room shifted. Vance lit up. New money. She loved new money, the drama of it, the unpredictability. Marcus looked at the new bidder. He did not know the man's face. He looked at the paddle number. He would find out later that the late bidder was a partner in a firm that Claudia Vance had advised as a broker 5 years earlier, a relationship she had not disclosed to the floor. He raised his paddle. 6.2, he said. Silence. The late bidder did not counter. 6.2 million, Vance said slowly, and this time she could not ignore the paddle number. She looked at it. She looked at him. Something moved across her face. Not quite recognition. Something closer to a calculation she had not expected to be making. 6.2. Do I have a counter? She waited the full 10 seconds. Sold, she said. Her voice was flat. The gavel came down. The contract signing was scheduled for the following morning. Marcus left Ashford Hall at 12:07 and took the bus back to Meridian Street. He climbed the stairs to his apartment, changed out of the gray jacket, and went down to the basement unit he used as an office. He sat at a wooden table covered in property folders and lease files, and a coffee mug from Nadia's school that said "World's Okayest Dad" in crooked block letters. He had looked at that mug every day for 2 years. He had never moved it. He had won the bid. That much was settled. What was not yet settled was the legal structure of the transfer. And that was where it began to come apart. At 3:14 that afternoon, a certified letter arrived at his registered business address, forwarded by his attorney. It was from Ashford Hall's legal department, and it contained a clause Marcus had not seen before. A clause that had not appeared in the catalog terms, nor in the floor day addenda he had reviewed twice before entering the room. The clause required that all buyers in Ashford's premium tier submit to an enhanced compliance review before transfer could proceed, and that this review could delay closing by up to 60 business days. 60 days in which the property remained in escrow, listed as pending, locked from any alternative buyers, but also locked from Marcus. His attorney, a woman named Rita Flores, called him at 3:45. "This clause," she said, "is not standard. I've reviewed every Ashford premium transfer from the last 4 years. This language has never appeared before." "First time," Marcus said. "For buyers fitting your profile, apparently." "I'm going to request the compliance review file. I want to know who initiated it." He already knew. But he let her work. The second legal document arrived 2 days later. It came from a different source. A zoning complaint filed with the city planning office against 14 Pemberton Square, the lot he had just won. The complaint alleged that the property's mixed-use classification was improper and requested a formal review that would place a stay on any transfer until the zoning status was confirmed. The complaint had been filed, according to the date stamp, the day after the auction concluded. 41 hours after the gavel came down. Marcus sat with that document for a long time. He sat at the table in his basement office while the building settled around him. The old pipes, the radiator, the faint sound of Mrs. Paulson's television on the second floor. He sat and he read the complaint twice, and then he set it face down on the table, and he looked at the wall. He had documentation. He had a purchase agreement, stamped and witnessed. He had a verified funds letter. He had the winning bid, recorded by 3 independent parties and time-stamped by Ashford's own system. None of that was in question. What Claudia Vance, and whoever had filed that zoning complaint on her behalf, was betting on was that he would not want the fight. That he would calculate the months, the legal costs, the uncertainty, and decide the building wasn't worth it. They had made an assumption about what kind of man he was. That night, he put Nadia to bed at 8:30. He read her 2 chapters of a book about a girl who trained horses in Iceland, which was the one they were working through that month. He turned off her lamp. He stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, looking at the shape of her under the blanket, the small fist near her cheek, the way she breathed with absolute certainty. He went back to the basement. He sat at the table for a long time in the dark, not working, thinking. He could expose all of it right now. Call 3 journalists he knew personally who would have the Vance zoning connection in print before morning. He had enough. Rita had already found the link between the zoning complaints filer and a firm that shared office space with Ashford's brokerage arm. Call. 1 document. It would be over by noon tomorrow. He did not make the call. He sat for another hour. Then he wrote Rita a single email. Continue through proper channels. No media. Full documentation only. He sent it at 11:22 p.m. He went to bed. The following Friday evening at 6:15, Nadia sat across from him at the kitchen table while he reviewed legal briefs. She was doing her own homework, a worksheet on fractions, and she had been quiet for 40 minutes, which was unusual. She was a talker during homework. She narrated her work, asked questions about questions, declared victories over long division with the solemnity of a general accepting surrender. Tonight she was quiet. He looked up. She was not looking at her worksheet. She was looking at him. He looked back. Said nothing. She said nothing. They sat like that for maybe 30 seconds, the kitchen quiet around them, the radiator ticking, the evening settling in through the window. Then she looked back down at her fractions. She picked up her pencil. He looked at his brief. He could not read it. He reached across the table and put his hand briefly on top of hers, not squeezing, just resting, and then took it back and returned to the page. She did not look up, but she started narrating her fractions again, quietly to herself, and the kitchen came back to its normal temperature. He was going to be fine. Douglas Hart had watched the auction floor more carefully than anyone in the room knew. He was 71 years old. He had been attending Ashford Hall's auctions since the building was under different ownership, and in that time he had witnessed the slow concentration of power in Claudia Vance's hands with the patient attention of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment to say something about it. He had said nothing because there had been nothing until now that qualified as evidence rather than observation. Now he had both. He made a call. Marcus did not know about it yet, but it was already in motion. The call from Rita Flores came at 7:52 on a Tuesday morning. Marcus was at the kitchen table. Nadia had already left for school, the 7:40 bus which she caught herself now, backpack bouncing, turning once at the corner to raise her hand in a wave he watched from the window. He was on his second coffee when the phone rang. "It's done," Rita said. He set the mug down. "Talk me through it." Douglas Hart filed a formal complaint with the State Auctioneer Licensing Board 11 days ago. He provided documentation of the post-auction compliance clause. He had a copy of the original Ashford premium transfer terms from 3 prior sales, none of which contained it. He also provided the bid acknowledgement logs showing you were passed over twice before he corrected the floor. He wasn't the only one. There were 2 other witnesses, both long-time buyers, who submitted supporting statements. "The zoning complaint?" Marcus asked. "Withdrawn." The city confirmed the filer. It was a registered agent connected to Meridian Capital's brokerage arm. The relationship wasn't disclosed to the auction floor. That's a material conflict. The planning office accepted the withdrawal this morning. He looked out the window, the corner where Nadia had turned and waved. "The transfer. Ready to proceed. Closing is set for Thursday at 2 p.m. Ashford's legal team asked that we not publicize the compliance review circumstances." She paused again, a longer pause. "They've also asked that the closing take place at Ashford Hall." He understood why. They wanted to control the setting, contain the story, make it a routine transaction. They did not want it to be what it actually was. "Fine," he said. "Thursday at 2. He arrived at Ashford Hall at 1:45 on Thursday afternoon. He wore the gray work jacket, the frayed collar, the paint stripe near the left cuff, the steel-toed boots, scuffed smooth at the toe. He had not chosen this deliberately, or rather, he had, in the way a man chooses things that feel true rather than things that feel strategic. He was a contractor. He owned property. He wore what he wore. The closing took place in the main conference room adjoining the auction floor. 4 people were present from Ashford's team. Rita was there, a notary, and a title transfer officer who had driven in from the county office. Claudia Vance was also there. This had not been in the original closing schedule. She entered 2 minutes before the signing, wearing the same composed, controlled expression she carried on the auction floor, and she took a seat at the far end of the table without a word to anyone. The documents were signed in order. Took 14 minutes. When the title officer confirmed the transfer and stamped the final page, the room held a moment of ordinary silence, the kind that follows paperwork rather than events. Then Douglas Hart walked in. He had not been invited to the closing. No one had told him it was today. He had simply arrived at Ashford Hall that morning for a separate appointment, seen the names on the conference room schedule, and knocked. He stood in the doorway in his gray coat, and he looked at Marcus sitting at the table with the signed documents in front of him, and he nodded once. Slow, certain, the nod of a man recognizing something that had been a long time coming. Marcus looked back at him. He held up the top document, the title page, so Hart could see the name on it. Hart smiled. Claudia Vance had been watching this exchange. Her hands were flat on the table. Her expression had not changed. But something had left it. Some quality of certainty, of forward momentum, that had defined every room she'd entered for 20 years. The room felt it. The title officer felt it. Rita felt it. Vance looked at Marcus. For the first time since the auction floor, she spoke to him directly. "I owe you an apology," she said. Her voice was careful, measured. The way a person's voice is when they are not sorry but understand that a statement of apology is required. The compliance review was not standard procedure. Marcus looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. His hands were still on the table. "I know," he said. That was all. He stood up. He shook hands with the title officer and the notary. He nodded to Rita. He walked to the doorway where Douglas Hart was standing, and the 2 men stood together in the threshold of the room for a moment, looking back at the table, at the documents, at the space that had just changed ownership. "Thank you," Marcus said. "You would have gotten there anyway," Hart said. Marcus didn't argue with that. Outside the conference room, the auction floor was set up for the afternoon session. The chairs arranged, the lots catalogued, the podium empty. Marcus walked through it slowly. He looked at the back row where he had sat still for 90 minutes on a Thursday morning with a frayed collar and scuffed boots and $11.4 million in a sealed envelope. He looked at the podium. He walked out into the afternoon. He called Nadia at 2:31. She picked up on the first ring. "Well," she said. "I bought it," he said. He could hear the ambient noise of her after-school program. Chairs scraping, voices layering over each other, the ordinary loud life of a room full of 7-year-olds. "I knew," she said. He walked down the front steps of Ashford Hall into the cold afternoon light, and he did not look back. 6 months later, 14 Pemberton Square was under full renovation. Marcus had filed the development plans within 2 weeks of closing. The mixed-use redesign called for 8 commercial units on the lower floors and 12 residential apartments above. Affordable rate units, half of them. He had not announced this. It had appeared in the city planning filings, which Douglas Hart had read, and which he had mentioned to 2 journalists over lunch, and which had then become a story that Marcus declined to participate in when called for comment. He was busy. He had work to do. Claudia Vance had stepped down from her position as Ashford Hall's chief auctioneer 3 months after the closing. The details of the licensing board complaint were never made public, a resolution that had suited both parties. She had moved to a smaller firm. She was, by all accounts, still good at her work. The man who had filed the zoning complaint had resigned from Meridian Capital's brokerage arm the same week the complaint was withdrawn. He had not been difficult to find. One afternoon in March, Marcus picked Nadia up from school. She climbed into the truck and dropped her backpack between her feet and looked out the window at the passing street. "Dad," she said. "Yeah." "At school today, Jonah said his dad is the most successful person he knows." He paused. "I told him mine was too." He glanced at her. She was looking out the window, watching the buildings go by. But then he said, "What does your dad do?" She turned to look at him. "What do I say?" Marcus thought about this for a block and a half. "Tell him," Marcus said, "that your dad builds things quietly and waits." She turned that over. "And then what?" she asked. He merged onto Meridian Street. The building at the corner, the one he owned, the one with the 3rd-floor apartment and the basement office and the mug that said "World's Okayest Dad," came into view. He pulled toward it. "Then they stand on their own," he said. She nodded slowly, like someone deciding whether they agree. She agreed. There is a version of this story where Marcus made noise. Where he called the journalists he knew and let them run with it. Where he walked back into Ashford Hall with documentation in hand and made sure Claudia Vance understood, publicly, what she had attempted. That version existed. He had sat with it at a wooden table in a basement at 11 p.m., with a coffee mug and a legal brief and the sound of his daughter breathing above him, and he had considered it fully. He put it down. What he understood, what men like Marcus understand, usually alone, usually in quiet rooms, usually without anyone watching, is that the moment you spend your energy on the person who wronged you, you have given them something. You have made them the center of the story. And the story was never about Claudia Vance. The story was about a building he had been watching for 22 months. About a daughter who waved at a corner. About the difference between what a person announces and what a person does. Dignity is not a performance. It is a decision made in private, repeated over time, until it becomes the only way you know how to stand.